Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to the Central U.S. Climate and Drought Outlook. I'm Dennis Toddy from the USDA Midwest Climate Hub in Ames, Iowa. I'm standing in as host for Doug Cluck, who is on assignment, shall we say, or at a meeting and maybe looking at Hoover Dam right now, as I think their agenda was, or somewhere in that area. So we welcome you. Glad to have you with us. This is our February installment looking at the monthly outlooks. We have Becky Bollinger, the Assistant State Climatologist at Colorado State University, joining us. As a reminder, again, as we do this, we'll have Becky do her presentation. Please, as along the way, you're welcome to enter your questions in the chat in the question box, and we'll deal with some of them along the way. And if not, we'll discuss them at the end. So, Becky, thanks for being here today, and why don't you go ahead and roll with it?
Great. Thank you, Dennis, and thanks for the introduction. Just a heads up that I am struggling with a head cold, so hopefully all my words come through clearly. And if I have a coughing episode, I might put you on mute, but otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. Some general information we have on these Central Region webinars that we've done. This is a great collaboration with state climatologists through the region, NOAA, various NOAA entities like NCEI, National Weather Service, OAR, NIDIS, also USDA climate hubs, the Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers, and the National Drought Mitigation Center. We will have our next Climate and Drought Outlook webinar on March 16th at this time, and that will be Zach Hoylman, who is the Assistant State Climatologist with the University of Montana. We have links here where you can access information for future webinars and also recordings of our past webinars. So for today's agenda, we're going to be looking at recent conditions, including ranks for January. Where did January lay out compared to other Januaries? The anomalous warmth a lot of people in the region have been experiencing. One example you can see here in the picture is Melissa from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center posted a picture of a tulip that's budding in Indiana where she is. So quite anomalously warm and starting to see those spring blooms coming out. We're also going to talk about clouds and precipitation and snow. Impacts we'll go over, including that early blooming, also some ag reports and a little bit of drought impacts. And then we're going to talk about the outlooks and the weakening La Niña and what we're looking at for the spring. So here we have maps for statewide temperature ranks across the contiguous United States for January 2023. So each state has a rank for how January 2023 compared to all of the other Januaries in the 129-year record. And so on the upper left, we're looking at the temperature ranks. And everywhere where you see those warm colors, the rank was above the average, and where we have white is in that near average ranking. So in our central region, near average rankings show up for Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming. But other than that, all the rest of the region, and really a significant portion of the country, ranked higher in terms of temperatures for January. And if we look at, and sorry, one more thing to mention is that for the entire contiguous United States, this was the 6th warmest January in that 129-year record. Switching over and looking at precipitation in the lower right-hand corner, everywhere where we have those greens are areas that ranked on the wetter side, and where we have browns are on the drier side. And so we can see, particularly up in North Dakota and Montana, we've had a bit drier ranks. North Dakota ranking 13th driest January in their record. But most of the other states in our region ranked wetter, including Nebraska, which ranked as its third wettest wettest January, and also some much wetter than average through Colorado and Iowa on either side there. So I wanted to break down, we looked at statewide average, but going down to the smaller scale and really looking at what conditions look like in January. And so on the left side, I'm focusing in on the minimum temperature. So not just the average temperature, but our overnight low temperatures, because that's where we're seeing a lot of those warm anomalies. And so what you can see here is that pretty much everywhere in the Midwest and then going east, we've got much above average ranked minimum temperatures. And then that red color, especially where you see it over Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, there's spots in Michigan and Ohio. Those areas experienced record warm minimum temperatures during the month of January. Now, as you go west, those anomalies start to level out a little bit. And the further west you go, there's not really any warm anomalies, particularly areas of Colorado, Wyoming, and western Montana. The other thing I wanted to point out is where we saw the heaviest precipitation in January. So the right side, we're looking at the precipitation ranks. And you can see that swath of very wet conditions extending from southern Wyoming, northern Colorado, through Nebraska and into Minnesota and Iowa. And a couple of those dark green areas are areas that we saw record wet conditions for January. So those areas popping out, particularly in the Nebraska Panhandle, northern Nebraska, northeast Colorado. And one thing to say about that is this isn't a terribly wet time of year, so it's not necessarily a huge deal to be much wetter. It doesn't take much to be much wetter, but that is where we've seen a lot of the wetness, looking at 2 to 3 inch anomalies above the average. Also want to point out that the northern half of our region has continued to see dryness, particularly in areas of Montana, North Dakota, descending down a little bit into South Dakota, and also northern part of Minnesota. One other thing I wanted to touch on is this persistent pattern we've had from the fall and into the winter, where we've been experiencing warmer temperatures in the east and cooler temperatures out west. And that is something, if we look back at these ranks, you see extending back into November. So this November through January time period, we can see those colder ranks to the west. And we see it on the west side of our region. And then as we transition from the high plains and into the Midwest, that's when we start seeing some of those warmer anomalies really pop. And this is a classic setup that we've had, where we're seeing large scale troughing in the west and then a large scale ridging to the east. That has also been able to drive some of those precipitation patterns that we've seen recently. So looking at what has happened since the beginning of February, the map on the left shows the amount of precipitation that has accumulated from February 1st to February 15th for the region. So areas that are in greens have seen at least a half an inch or more. Primarily our Midwestern locations and towards the Great Lakes region, a little bit less as we look into Ohio, Kentucky area, and also a little bit less as we go into the high plains towards the west. The littler map to the right shows that precipitation for that time period as a % of normal. And so the areas where you can really see that that precipitation has been above average is this band that occurred right here around the Kansas-Missouri border up through western Iowa and into Minnesota. And then we've had those dry pockets again in the Dakotas, Wyoming, little bit in Colorado, western Kansas, and then that dry pocket again in Kentucky, Ohio. As for temperatures, here's what we're looking at: actual average temperatures for February 1st through February 15th. And so the line between the blue and the green is just about freezing or close to freezing. It's that 30-degree Fahrenheit line. And so we can see the average temperatures south of there have largely been close to or above freezing, and then colder temperatures to the north. And when we look at that as a departure from average, we can see that for most of the region, this is a warmer than average pattern, something that has continued for a lot of the Midwest and Great Lakes. Much warmer than average conditions we're seeing through Montana and the Dakotas. Interestingly enough, we've got this little patch of cooler than average in northeast Colorado and the Nebraska Panhandle, which is largely due to some stubborn snow cover in the area that's helped to keep those temperatures down. So you might have been wondering, has it been cloudy lately? And the answer to that question is definitely yes. So this is a map made by Brian Brettschneider, who's with NOAA in Alaska, and he took a gridded model product with data back to 1950 and looked at the amount of cloudiness in January and how that compared to January's in that record for that model. So everywhere where you see gray, it's a top 10 cloudiest January in that record. And then as we get into those darker grays, you can see where it's either second cloudiest or cloudiest on record. I live in this record cloudiest area in northern Colorado. I've definitely been feeling it. Even areas that generally can experience more cloudiness in the Midwest and Great Lakes region have seen more cloudiness than normal. So that was a model, but we are seeing this in observation data as well. Our Wisconsin state climatologist, Steve Vavris, did this where he looked at the percent of sky cover data from National Weather Service and looked at different sites around Wisconsin. And basically what he saw was the white bars here are different locations and what their normal cloudy January looks like. And then the gray on top shows how much cloudier it was compared to the normal line. And so in all locations around Wisconsin, it was cloudier. And when he averaged all those locations over time, that's what this bar is going back to 2006. You can see if you're above average cloudy, you'd be above the zero line. Below average cloudy, you'd be below the zero line. And 2023 really sticks out for just how cloudy it has been. One thing to mention on that I didn't mention earlier is those anomalously warm minimum temperatures we saw can really be attributed to all this cloudiness. When you have extra cloud cover, that really prevents your low temperatures from dropping too much, which is why we're seeing such huge anomalies in those minimum temperatures. So this is a product out through the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and it's a measure of winter severity. So it takes into account your temperature, the amount of snowfall you have, how much snow there is on the ground, and then accumulates that over time to see how severe has your winter been throughout the cold season. And so when we're looking at this, anywhere where we have red or orange dots, sorry that there's no legend on this, I'll have to add a legend for later, but the red and orange dots are areas that are experiencing a more mild winter. And where you have yellow, it's closer to average. And then where you have these blue and purple dots are areas that are experiencing a more severe winter. And so this is pretty much in line with what we've seen with the temperatures so far, that we've had a very mild winter along much of the eastern United States. And then we start to transition to Minnesota, the Dakotas, western Nebraska, and to the west, where we're experiencing that more severe winter. So a couple of examples I wanted to show you are here on the eastern side of the region. We're at Indianapolis in this example, and you can see the shaded colors are how that winter severity accumulates over time throughout the cold season. And so if you're going to stay in that green shading, you would be in an average winter severity, and the black line is the current season. So we've had very little accumulation since the beginning of January. A little bump, I'm assuming with a cold snap in December, and then it's kind of been a little bit flat accumulation, and so that is how they ended up in this red category, being mild winter severity in Indianapolis. And then shifting west to Sedgwick, which is in northeast Colorado and close to the Nebraska Panhandle, that's where we're seeing some of the most extreme winter severity categories. So as you can see here, basically since mid-December, we've had much greater accumulation in winter severity than what's normal. And a lot of that is driven by not just the snowfall, but the persistent snow cover in the area has put us in an extreme winter severity category there. So here's a look at the snow depth for the region. This product is from NOAA's NORISC, and anywhere where you see shading that's not green is where we currently have snow cover over the region. So a little bit of snow cover is this grayish, which is just a trace of snow cover to 2 inches of depth. And then obviously we get into the mountain higher elevation areas. We're seeing a lot of snow cover. Notable in the lower elevations throughout the eastern plains of Colorado into Kansas, we've got between 4 and 8 inches of snow cover still there. And then as we go into the northern high plains, we're seeing quite a bit of snow cover throughout the Dakotas, Minnesota, and into northern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan. Recently, the Weather Prediction Center put out a map to show that snowfall product, to show the total snowfall that we've seen this season and how that compares to average for this time. So from October 1st to February 15th, the snowfall that has fallen, if you're in a green or blue category, you've had more snow than average for that time period. And if you're in a brown category, you've had less snowfall than average for that time period. And so where we're seeing the greatest positive departures are in our interior Rockies, higher elevations on the west side of the region, where most areas have seen a foot to 4 or 5 feet more of snow than average for this time. And we also see that swath going from northeast Colorado through Nebraska, South Dakota, and into Minnesota. Interestingly enough, we see in southern Nebraska, southern Iowa, into Illinois and Indiana that they are less than average snow. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they're drier than average, but they have had less snow, which means more of their rain, more of their precip has been falling as rain rather than snow, which is another testament to the warm anomalies we've been experiencing. This is a look at snowpack in the higher elevations. So focusing in on the west side of the central region, we have Minnesota up here, or Montana up here at the top. And then going down towards Wyoming and Colorado. Anywhere where you have white or green, the snowpack is near average to above average as of February 14th. So we're looking really good. Areas that start to go into that tan or orange are areas that are seeing slightly below average snowpack. So one of our westernmost basins in Montana is a little bit below average. And then also of note is the headwaters of the Arkansas River in Colorado is at 75% of average. Aside from a couple of these though, most of the basins are looking pretty decent for snowpack so far. I'm gonna skip these. I was gonna take them out, but move on to soil moisture. So this is a soil moisture product which takes into account a bunch of models and says how dry or wet is the soil compared to average. And so where we have white, you're in that near average range for soil moisture. Where we have those reds, our soil moisture that is a little bit more dry. We really see that highlighted over western Kansas and into areas of Nebraska. And then where you have the greens are areas that have a little bit wetter soil moisture, which we don't see much of in our region, but we have been seeing some improving soil moisture conditions. Models haven't been quite capturing them in our Great Lakes Midwest region, but we have seen some improvement to drought conditions with recent rains there. This is from the USGS, our 28-day average stream flow as of February 14th. So again, where you have the greens and blues are stream flows that are above average at this time. They're in that near normal to above normal categories. And so most of the region around the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, throughout there are looking pretty decent right now. Again, you can see as we move west, particularly into drought-stricken Kansas, that's when we start to see those streams drying out a little bit. Not much activity to report in the north because a lot of those streams are going to be ice affected. Although we have heard, because of the anomalous warmth, that in southern Minnesota, some of those have become open streams already, which is pretty anomalous for this time of year. This is a look at the Great Lakes ice cover. So where we would have these grays into dark grays and blacks are areas where there is ice concentration. As you can see, we don't have a lot of grays because there is not a lot of ice cover to talk about. Total ice cover right now is 6.6%, which is very near record low for this time of year. One sample to point to is looking at Lake Superior average ice cover. So the red line is how we typically expect the ice cover percentage to increase across the lake. And about this time right now, we should be almost to 40% ice coverage, and we're almost ice free there. So this is very low ice cover that we're seeing across the Great Lakes, which is also a testament to the warm anomalies we've been experiencing. This is a look at the drought conditions. This map was released this morning. It's of conditions as of the morning of February 14th. So anywhere where you have yellow is an abnormally dry category. And then where you have the other colors, that's when we get into our drought categories of D1 through D4. So point out that on the eastern side of our central region, we don't have as much drought. We do have a little bit of drought conditions in Michigan, in the Mitten, and then some abnormally dry pockets throughout. But most of the drought conditions we're experiencing in the region are to the west, particularly areas in Nebraska, and Kansas has been hit quite hard for quite some time, and that is where we see most of the worst drought in that D4 category. So let's switch over and talk about some of the impacts we've been seeing through the region. First, I'm going to talk about the warm impacts, because the warm has really been a consistent part of the conversation today. This picture on the right here is of a bear that was rudely awakened from hibernation. This is in Minnesota. This picture is taken by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. In Minnesota, where they've been experiencing some early warm-up, early snow melt, and it led to flooding of a culvert where this bear was hibernating, and some very many pesky, concerned humans came along to try to help the bear out, and they ended up having to move the bear. But also, we're seeing because of the warmth that where there is snow, we're also having heavy rain happening on top of that snow, particularly northern Wisconsin, where that's impacting recreation such as cross-country skiing. As far as vegetation, we are seeing that early bud swelling, vegetation coming out of dormancy. This may seem like a good thing, but this does put that vegetation at risk from any late freezes that the area might experiencing. From Indiana, we've heard that winter wheat planting is having a rough time because they usually need that frozen ground to put in shots of nitrogen, but they're not getting frozen ground, so they're having challenges with that. Additionally, mud challenges throughout the region. In Ohio, maple production is possibly increasing because of the early warmth. So there could be early, but that doesn't necessarily mean sufficient production of maple coming out of Ohio. So that's something to keep an eye on. So one of the things we were talking about is chilling hours, and many of the fruits throughout the central region, particularly in the Midwest, rely on chilling hours, the amount of time that the vegetation stays dormant, and this ideal range of temperatures close to freezing that signal to the vegetation that it's time to come out of dormancy. And so in a lot of areas in the Midwest, we're looking at chilling hours that are well above average right now. So in this map, we can see here where we have greens are areas of the country that have more chilling hours than they would normally have by this time of year, which is going to push those fruit crops or other crops to come out of dormancy sooner than they normally would. So particularly these areas where we see that dark green of 200 to 400 chilling hours above average, we're talking about areas that could be 3 weeks ahead of schedule. So a lot of the vegetation is going to start peeping out right now and say, is it spring? And Mother Nature is probably going to say at some point, nope, not yet. We have had some flooding impacts, but not too much. This picture to the right is of a flood rescue in southern Illinois from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office. They had some consistently dry conditions and then followed that with about 4 to 6 inches of above normal rainfall, which led to that very localized flooding in the area. Aside from that, we've been seeing just pretty typical flooding issues for this type of year. On the Mississippi, we're going to have pretty much near normal flood risk as we head into the spring. In the Missouri Basin, where we've had a lot more drought, that's actually going to help lower the flood risk. So even in areas where we're getting an excellent snow cover and a lot of snowpack, the flood risk is actually reduced because of the drought in the region. However, both of these are going to be caveated by what happens in the coming weeks. If we do have a lot more precipitation coming, a lot more snow coming, that could increase flood risks, both periodic as we're talking about precipitation events, and bigger as we talk about more snowpack being added on. Other impacts, this is a picture I got from Chip Redman in Kansas, looking at Kansas winter wheat in western Kansas. Winter wheat not looking good there. A lot of the grounds not only suffering from drought, but lack of snow cover, and that lack of snow cover is exposing the ground to all the elements. In western Nebraska, there has been some very deep snowpack due to that really wet January we had, and that has required supplemental feeding for livestock in the area. In the east part of the region, we're looking at that increased risk of wetness leading to delayed planting in the Corn Belt. So that could be an issue. Not only are the fruit crops dealing with challenges of above average chilling hours, but due to cold snaps earlier in the year and late last year, they're assessing some damage because of cold snaps. So two sides of that story there, the warm and the cold. So we're going to shift and look to the future now. Here is our 7-day precipitation forecast. This is as of this morning, going through next Thursday morning. We have a pretty active pattern to look at. Quite a bit more mountain snowfall to fall in the western part of the region. Looking at about a ½ an inch, quarter-inch to ½ an inch in a swath here across South Dakota. A little bit lighter accumulations to the south of there. Then as we get into the eastern portion of the region, a lot more active precipitation pattern with precipitation totals over a ½ an inch and over an inch in some areas. Kentucky looking to get in on quite a bit of action there. The 8 to 14 day outlook goes beyond that period. So 2 weeks away, what are we looking at? This is from the Climate Prediction Center. The map on the left shows the chance of above normal or below normal temperatures. And so everywhere where we have the blues is the risk of below normal temperatures. Where we have the reds are increased chances of above average temperatures. Aside from a tiny little sliver of the central region in this enhanced chance of above normal temperatures, a lot of the region will be at risk of below average temperatures, particularly as we move further north and further west into that region. On the right is the precipitation outlook for that period 2 weeks from now. Where there are greens are areas where we're expecting possibly above average precipitation. Of note for here, western mountains area, but also around Ohio, a little bit of extra chance of above average precipitation, closer to near normal for most other areas, with a very slight leaning of above average to the north. We do have a lot of hazards to talk about. According to the Climate Prediction Center, these are great products that show you what the risk is of certain hazards and what the dates are for those hazards. And so I really wanted to point out here the hazard of much below normal temperatures throughout the region, particularly to the north, as we talked about. So if you look at Montana, they have a high risk of much below normal temperatures around February 23rd, 24th. So really about a week from now, we're going to be looking at some very hazardous cold temperatures through the area. Slight risk of those hazardous cold temperatures through more of the region, but really focus there on Montana and surrounding areas. There is also the risk of heavy precipitation, so particularly want to point that out for Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. This is obviously going to lead to further challenges where areas where there's mud and warm anomalies that will be adding some possibility of heavy precipitation on there in a couple of time periods through late February. There's also a risk for heavy snow. If we're looking at the interior Rockies, that risk is from basically February 23rd through March 1st, risk of heavy snow through the Rockies. We're also looking at a slight risk of heavy snow around Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan late in February, so something to keep in mind. And finally, we have a risk of high winds for the end of the month, extending across a lot of the western half of the central region. So released this morning are our monthly and seasonal climate outlooks. And this one is looking at what we're expecting for March. The temperature outlook is on the left, the precipitation outlook is on the right. So these are looking at below average temperatures are more likely in the northern part of the region for March. with equal chances through a lot of the rest of the region. Equal chances means there's not a lot of guidance there, so it could be above average temperatures, below average temperatures, or near average. But that slight leaning for below average temperatures more likely to the north. For precipitation, a lot of our region is seeing that above average or increased chance of above average precipitation. So we're seeing that across Minnesota, North Dakota, and then extending down through the Midwest and around the Great Lakes region there. And then over Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, we're seeing that equal chances where there's a lot of uncertainty and, you know, it could go either way, wet or dry or normal. Looking at the spring outlook, so that's taking March and including April and May with it, we're sticking with a pretty La Nina pattern here when looking at the temperature and precipitation outlooks, where that colder than average is slightly more likely for the northwestern part of the region, uncertainty throughout the central part of the region, and then a slight enhanced above average chance for temperatures throughout Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio. When we're looking at the precipitation, we see that bullseye with the Great Lakes. This is pretty common for a La Nina pattern to see more likely above average precipitation conditions. Also been pretty persistent with what we've been seeing with the trends that we'll have more wetter than average conditions throughout the Midwest Great Lakes region, and a bullseye of below average precipitation showing up over the Four Corners and Southwest. I wanted to share, this isn't a forecast per se, but it is going to be a good guideline to know when a typical last freeze happens. This is going to be particularly important to keep in mind as we know that a lot of the vegetation is going to be coming out of dormancy, that what is typical for a last hard freeze of 28 degrees throughout a lot of the region, if you're following these yellows and tans, we're looking at mid to late April for that last hard freeze. A little bit later as we go to the northwest, and then as we go to the southeast part of the region, southern Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Indiana, we're talking late March. Now that is the median time period for that last freeze. Even if we had an early last freeze, an earlier than average last freeze, for a lot of that area, that still would not happen until mid to late March and early April. So that means that it is very likely that we are going to have a hard freeze happen over a lot of the areas where we're seeing vegetation coming out of dormancy. And so that is likely to be a significant impact as we go into the spring. I mentioned La Nina, which we are in, but I also wanted to mention that our La Nina is expected to weaken. It has been weakening. It is likely that the La Nina will end and will transition into neutral conditions by the spring. So this is from the Climate Prediction Center, where they look at what is the likelihood of each category. A blue would be the probability of La Nina, the gray is probability of neutral conditions, and the red is probability of El Nino conditions. And so in that January, February, March time period here at the beginning of the graph, we see that the La Nina is most likely. But as we transition more into the spring, by the time we get to that March, April, May category here, our most likely conditions will be neutral. Very unlikely we will still be in the La Nina. And then you can see as we start to go to summer, we do know there's a lot more uncertainty in our models predicting what happens as we go into the summer, but they are showing some confidence that we will be transitioning into an El Nino sometime in the summer and going into the fall. Couple of key messages I wanted to summarize for our spring outlook. We are expecting wetter than average conditions for much of the Midwest and Great Lakes region. that La Nina is weakening, and you can expect a transition to neutral conditions in the spring. Late season cold snaps are going to be a risk. Even when we're experiencing warmer than average, that's still something to keep in mind. And while flood risk is pretty normal right now for the Mississippi, those wet conditions that we're experiencing could increase those risks for a lot of the eastern half of our region. One other thing I didn't put on here, and I should have, but that our snowpack is looking decent, and so going into the spring, we're looking at having a nice normal runoff, at least in areas that aren't in drought from the snowpack. Some further information to share where you can get those webinars again. Contact information if you have further questions. When this webinar is ended, you can reach out to me, to Dennis or Doug. Melissa's with the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. Molly is with NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System, and Brian is a great drought contact with the Drought Monitor. I finished. If we have any questions.
Great, thanks, Becky. You can give your voice a rest for just a minute. Hopefully you're holding up okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job because there's not that many questions. So just a reminder, if people do have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we can we can deal with those. We do have a couple questions along the way. Briefly, did you mention the spring flood outlooks? I may have missed that if you did.
I did not. I realized I ran out of time and didn't include those in there. The webinars that there are.
Yeah, I'll briefly. We didn't try to hit on all the flood aspects a little bit. National Weather Service River Forecast Centers will be addressing these. There are a set of spring Outlook webinars. The next one will be on February 23rd. You can Google that or look at National Weather Service offices in the central part of the country and get more details about the flood outlooks in your area. There is a bit of nuance to these. The Becky did touch on there. The Missouri is despite a lot of snowpack, there's not major issue because the reservoirs have plenty of capacity to hold at this point unless something astounding happens, while the eastern Midwest is getting a bit wetter right now. So, okay, there was a question and a couple comments on the cloudiness. I'll touch on the comment here first, confirming the cloudiness from one of our partners up in Minnesota. Said their greenhouse growers who grow greens in greenhouses midwinter had taken note of that they were seeing the same thing, a lack of sunlight and a lack of solar radiation that was showing up and reduced growth in their greenhouses. So that was a confirmation of that. And then the question, I'll start with you and then see if we have any come between us come up with a great answer on this. What caused the extensive cloudiness in 2023?
That is a very good question, and I don't know if I have an answer. I mean, for some areas, localized, my first thought was we've been getting a very persistent storm activity pattern, and especially when we're leaving snow on the ground, you're just giving more to evaporate and put that moisture into the atmosphere, but it seems more widespread than that. But the Great Lakes are another example that if you are in the Great Lakes region and they're not frozen, that's another great pump of moisture that can add to the cloudiness. So those are my two best guesses, but I don't know if that explains all of it.
And I would agree with you that the area that you show as being cloudy lined up very well with the wettest areas too. So if you want to dive into a bit about weather and what we call synoptics in weather, we have cold air over the western part of the U.S. and warm air over the eastern part of the U.S. And when you have that kind of pattern, the jet stream is going to tend to be active across the middle part of the country. Hence why we've had a lot of precipitation. I would assume that's probably related to the cloudiness. And where in the winter it's hard to burn off cloudiness sometimes too, unlike you can get in the summertime. So I think that's about the best we can do at this point. So there's a question here about the fire weather outlook. What's our fire weather outlook? Becky, you and I think that didn't come up during the comment yesterday. So do you have something handy to show on that?
Have it in our drought pages here, so I was just gonna pull it up.
Okay.
This is from the Predictive Services National Interagency Fire Center, and it doesn't look like there's much of anything to talk about. Normal risk for wildfire for now.
Okay, and yeah, as long as we've got snowpack and some wetness, that's going to keep the fire potential relatively low to at least start the year. So okay.
I would say where it's not shown here, but I would expect the biggest risk would be in Kansas, where there's areas with lack of snow cover and drier than average conditions and lower stream flows. Once we get into that windy season, that risk for high wind, and April is also a very windy season, that could be an increased risk for those grass fires in those areas, would be my best guess.
That'd probably extend into southeastern Colorado too, given what you were mentioning yesterday, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, and then we have the ultimate question: how much snow rain would be needed to improve drought conditions in eastern Nebraska, South Dakota, and western Iowa?
That's a good question.
Do you want me to field that one?
I mean, I don't know how much the well, I do know how much the deficits are, right? Dennis, maybe you have an idea of how much snow is typical for these areas after, like, from March, April, May.
Yeah. It's and Jerry, you bring up the really tough question. You know, that area that you're talking about, we've had a good amount of snowfall, but it's on top of frozen ground. So that when that snow melts, most of it's going to run off. Well, a little bit will enter the soil moisture. So it's improving that runoff will improve that part of the drought situation. The soil moisture, it's going to have to get rid of the snow and get the frost out of the ground and then start getting rainfall before we can start improving the drought conditions even more. We don't have a good number because it's always a hard number to assess of how much you're going to improve. Any rainfall is going to help. And we do expect, Becky didn't include the seasonal drought outlook that was just released today, but it also is pointing towards drought improvement, which is just a typical spring situation. And that also is concurrent with the outlooks that she showed too, that there's some better chances for precipitation going along. Okay. With the transition to El Nino, can we expect some flood producing storms in the Midwest?
I think if we're talking the spring or the summer, regardless of a transition to El Nino, I think there would be the risk of storm producing floods.
Or flood producing storms, whichever case may be.
Yeah, that one.
and the thing we have to context there is that especially the Missouri River folks will say there is always some isolated flood potential on the lower Missouri and tributaries of lower Missouri just because of spring thunderstorm events. it's the Missouri right now. Widespread flooding is not likely. If things go on the Mississippi River, there's potential for some larger issues, but certainly isolated events, especially when you have snow on the ground like we have now and on frozen ground. If you put an inch of water on that in a rainfall event and you get the rainfall combined with snow melt, then we could produce some isolated flooding, or that along with ice jams could be producing problems too. So. Okay, is the low ice coverage in the upper Great Lakes unprecedented, and what could be the impact to spring conditions if known?
I do think it's not unprecedented, but it is near record from, I believe, what we've heard, that this is not something that, it is something that we've seen before, but it is certainly notable that we have such low ice conditions. What does that mean for the region moving forward? I am less familiar with my Great Lakes region, but I would assume that there's going to be continued risk for lake effect snows later in the season than what there normally is for areas that are coastal and nearby. As we go into the spring, I'm unsure. Doug or Dennis, do you have an idea?
Yeah, you're right. Still potential for lake effect snows, and probably allow the area to warm up a little more quickly. If you don't have lake ice or as cold a water around, that will allow warm up to occur more quickly. It is an interesting feature that has just come up in some conversations, different project, about the change that has occurred in lake ice since the late 1990s. That there has been a shift towards less lake ice, and not as frequent and not as much coverage of lake ice. So it's a change that has been noted, and asking questions as to exactly what, other than warmer conditions, if there's anything else leading to it. We have a comment that the cloudiness graphic is informative and additional. Unfortunately, it's not a regular product that is created. It was a one-off from one of our partners, but we can see if we can keep it going. I agree. It is, like, along with the windy conditions we've had at times, it's a good addition. So,
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, definitely. The moment I saw it, I was like, oh, good. It's confirming what I know, but I definitely don't think it's something that's made regularly, but could be beneficial, especially in times where you're like, what is going on?
Is the big storm system moving through now unusual this time of year?
Not that I'm aware of. At least it wasn't for me. It's just, I think it's part of that persistent pattern that we've been seeing, that I think it's pretty typical for a winter storm pattern. Has it been notably different for you, Dennis?
No, not really. This type of year is the time when climatology increases. We tend to get more precipitation, more moisture is available. When I was a state climatologist, the question always came up, well, is it related to state tournaments? Because there are a lot of state tournaments that occur, basketball and wrestling tournaments. And we just note that it's just the tournaments are going on. This is a time of year when it starts getting more active, and you have more potential for big winter storms. So,
I would say particularly late February and early March, you still have winter holding on, but you're also getting the sun angle is now getting higher in the sky, and you're starting to get long enough days that that's playing into it as well. So you're right, that's allowing, there's more moisture in the air. It can mean more wacky swings one way or the other, but winter is still there, so you still get those cold and deep troughs, and so that's certainly, I think, when the winter weather starts getting more interesting.
And I guess to add on to that, it is also a time of year, say in the Northern Plains, where you have lots of livestock. It's a time of year where they start doing calving, and sometimes that
Yeah.
calving occurs out in the open. So it is a riskier time of year for that. But when you have drought conditions that we have in some of the areas, the producers will accept that risk that happens to the livestock to get that moisture they need on the ground for the rangeland. We have a couple more
Yeah.
comments. I'm sorry, go ahead, Becky.
Oh, I said good point.
We have a couple more comments on burning down in Kansas, Oklahoma. And I think we've covered all the questions. And there, one more comment about spring fire risk, concern about how quickly the snow melt occurs and it running off rather than soaking in those places where it can. So otherwise, I think we have covered all the questions that we there. So we appreciate the comments and questions. Becky, do you have any last comment you want to toss on?
Nope, I think it's good. Just expect this continued strange winter to continue, or I don't know, it's been strange for me, just active pattern. So but yeah, as we go into spring, I think conditions are looking good for a normal runoff from the mountains, and the area to really look to keep fingers crossed for improvement is Kansas. Really bad situation there. So.
And I'll toss on too that Becky mentioned the wetness in the eastern corn belt. That is not that untypical for this time of year to have some wetness. It is quite a transition from where we were in the fall, where we had some quite dry soils. Now we're starting to get wetter. So it's not a severe problem yet, but with the outlooks and potential situation, there are some increasing risks. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Becky, thank you very much. Great job as usual. So
Thank you.
come join us. Can join us next month when Zach Hoylman from Montana will be our presenter, and we'll have more to talk about at that point. Have a great month. We'll see you next time.